Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to welcome to the show John Washington, who is a staff writer at Arizona Luminaria, a community-focused media outlet where he writes about the border, climate change, democracy, and more. He's written for the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Nation, and others. And his most recent book is called The Case for Open Borders. And you can find his other writings at Substack at johnwashington.substack.com. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I must congratulate you on not just a really powerful book in terms of the research, but a really beautifully written book. I feel like sometimes, so often, books that are so stacked with information can feel like you're reading Encyclopedia Britannica, but that was not the case at all. And I mean, there's so many threads that I could pull on, but I want to start with the framing here and the conversation of borders being synonymous not only with violence, which we'll talk about in a bit, but also a violent history and present of colonialism and of nation state building. And therefore, with the inherent hypocrisy and arbitrariness in aid of that colonial nation state. And for instance, many tend to think of borders as like these stagnant things that never move. And yet, as you write in the book, quote, the border can be moved to ensure its immovability. It can be violated to prove its inviolability. It can be crossed to prove its uncrossability, end quote. And I think that that's just such a beautiful way of succinctly highlighting the contradictions of the border. Could you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that, by what you wrote there?
I mean, I think there's a number of inherent paradoxes in bordering. We could list a bunch of them. One is that the very idea of closing down a border or criminalizing border crossing, what it does is creates a crime. That crime would not exist if we didn't look at human mobility the way that we do, which is in like as if it's a problem, when we know that it's not only inherent to our species, but it is a necessary means of survival. A couple other paradoxes include the fact that people know that we need migrants. Let's stick with the United States right now. There are really serious shortages in various sectors of the economy. Corporations, CEOs, politicians who are sort of, in the pocket of a lot of those corporations, they too know that our country, our economy heavily relies and increasingly relies on relatively cheap labor, on new influxes of labor. And we know that if we actually do what now more and more politicians are saying, deport all of the undocumented people, close down the border, limit both legal and quote unquote illegal migration. We can talk about why I'm putting scare quotes there, that it would tank the economy. It would be terrible. We know that. And yet we play this bizarre game where, especially politicians, where anti-immigrant or immigrant restrictionists are speaking out of both sides of their mouth, would say, we need to shut down the border, but we need people to get across the border. It's like, wait, you actually can't have it both ways. And yet the border is having it both ways. Because, what the border actually does is, speaking in real terms, it kills people along the line who are trying to cross it, or makes their lives much more difficult. It makes their crossings much more dangerous. It makes them suffer more as they try to cross it. And it immiserates people on both sides of the line. So the people who have crossed, who are not granted work papers or work authorization, they are subject to exploitation, lower wages, less worker protections. The people on the other side of the line are stuck, especially just like, again, sticking with US-Mexico, they're stuck in very precarious labor situations, very precarious just existential situations. And they also are making less money. They're being paid less for the same work that they would be doing on this side of the line. And they, have less worker protections, less worker safety rights, all these things. They're unionized at less rates. So the border doesn't protect, just talk to an economist. The border doesn't protect one side from the other. What it does is it creates the gaps that then push people from one side to the other. The paradoxes just accelerate from here. So when I was writing that specific line, I think I was referencing, if I remember right, I was referencing that the border is malleable. We decide to enforce the border in different ways at different times. We actually position the border in different places at different times. For the last number of years, a number of decades now, we have all grown accustomed to the United States, the border sort of following the logo map of the United States. But you start peeling back decades before that, and the border line was changing dramatically. And now, too, not in strictly like juridical terms, but the border is still very much moving. We are co-opting Mexico, other countries, in Central America, to enforce what is essentially our border further and further south. This is happening in the EU too. Now, no longer is it just the Mediterranean coastline or the Greek-Turkish border or the Eastern European borders, but you see that Frontex is, and even individual European countries are pushing the border down by co-opting Libyan Coast Guard, then Nigerian Border Patrol, basically agents. And so you see that the border does actually move. And one more really concrete example here that is just, I think, so illuminating is I spoke or wrote at relative length in the book about Australia. They actually decided to cut off an island that was part of the national territory of Australia because asylum seekers were able to access it more easily. It was like 1,000 miles off the coast of Australia. Through the logic of colonialism, they somehow claimed it was their own, and migrants started showing up there, and they're like, well, what do we do? We have to legally process these people now. What do we do? How do we deal with it? Like, oh, maybe we should just pretend that that's no longer Australian territory. How convenient. And so, there is what they were doing by changing the actual borderline is trying to protect the border. So yeah, paradoxes abound about bordering.
Yeah, that example about Australia in the book is just so like, wow, you're really you're proving the point here.
That's wild. Yeah.
And I want to get to kind of like the psychology of this, because you go into this as well, that what borders, especially militarized borders, speak of with regards to what's on the other side, what's on the inside of them. And you write, quote, "A border wall or a border gate reveals a nationalist fiction based on a mythologically constructed present and an often apocryphal past more than any geographic, cultural, or political truth," end quote. So really, it seems that the borders, while a very physical aspect, it's really a psychological aspect. And so when we're talking about the case for open borders, it seems that you first have to break down a mythology, which is certainly not an easy task, I would say. Could you talk a little bit more about this, like the psychology and the mythology of borders that we really latch onto?
Yeah. I think a easy way of understanding the problem here is a quip that often gets used to defend borders. People say something like, well, you lock your doors at night, so wouldn't you want to close your border to protect people from coming in? Because this is our little private, sacred space, whatever. This is our home, and if people come in, it could be a problem for you. So we should lock our doors. It's like, okay, that analogy breaks down for a lot of reasons. One, I actually addressed this in the books, like comparing a nation state to a individual private home doesn't make any sense. But there's one other, I think, really crucial way that this analogy falls apart, and is that, okay, probably if you're a homeowner, you paid for your home or are still paying for your home. You took out, a mortgage, you're paying the bank, or maybe you were able to buy it straight up. That was a legal process involving two consenting parties. That is not the way that borders are drawn. That is not the way that nation states, modern nation states, have been created. So if we were to actually analogize how nation states were created into a home, it would be like these people burst into this house, evicted the people who were living there peacefully, tore it to pieces, completely remodeled it, and then put new locks on the door. So is it just ethically, or from a moral perspective, or from a legal perspective, do you have the right to live in that home and block people from coming in? I don't think you do. I mean, I don't think anyone would really think you do. And that is the way that borders actually work. And that is, so the needing to break down the mythology, this is, obviously a pretty simplistic analogy there, but think about how borders were created. And when we hark back to, oh, it didn't used to be like this. Well, that also I think is, fault tripping into like some sort of historical amnesia, but also just trying to understand like how these borders were created. Like, the United States-Mexico border, people came in and there was genocide that took place, and was how now the United States is able to claim these territories for their own. They, literally slaughtered and tried to put an end to multiple cultures. Then they, at gunpoint, stole land from another nation state, Mexico, and now erected these borders. So like harking back to this idea of this pristine recent past is just blinding yourselves to a really bloody history. Like I try not to only focus on the United States in the book, because a lot of other borders are really telling, and I think really important to understand. And I think maybe, in fact, like the, Fortress Europe is maybe one of the most important borders of the world right now. There too is the same thing. It's like, how were these borders drawn? How were these territories claimed by the people who now supposedly have control over them? It's a very similar history. And then you look into different parts of the world, and you notice that, like, well, in Africa, I think, I can't remember the number right now. It's like 80% of the African countries have straight lines as borders. And it's like, you think that actually complied or represented the divisions of cultures? No, it didn't. And like, as that, because those cultures and many indigenous cultures throughout the world did not have exclusive lines of control. I'm not saying that it was a heyday. I mean, it's not like there was no war and no incursions and no attempts at territorial conquest, but there was something very different along the edges of control. And it wasn't exclusive militarized bordering, which cements some of those problematic pasts. Like I think that actually, some versions of tribalism that was, prevalent throughout the globe are not the way forward. And like, we shouldn't be returning to that past before borders either. But bordering actually sort of exacerbates that tribalist mindset. And so we need to be advancing beyond this idea of like supposed ethnic exclusionary communities, which are not realistic and never really have been, and thinking about actually a way that people can move about the globe or the world or whatever part of it in a safe, orderly, humane way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned the Europe border, because it highlights another aspect, which is, Africa has been for quite some time the colonialist playground of Europe, just as South and Central America is, thanks to the
Sure.
Monroe Doctrine, is the colonialist playground of the United States. And where do you see that migration coming from? Places that have been destroyed by these colonialist and imperialist policies. Well, maybe if you were less of the colonialist imperialist superpower, you wouldn't have this problem.
Yeah, I mean, and it's ongoing too, of course. And even actually, so the neocolonialism, or the shades of colonialism today are still uprooting people. This isn't something from the past either. And even the proffered solutions, a lot of times there was a much ridiculed proposal, I think it was an early Biden administration, that they would inject all this money into Central America. There was like a number of different proposals. Actually, Biden was involved in it when, under the Obama administration as well. It was going to be $1 billion of development aid. There's going to be $500 million, and not very much of it actually went through. But that too, the way that it is designed or where that money is going to land doesn't really help. I mean, the legacy of corporate extractivism in Central America has been a huge driver of immigration. So that this is not going to stabilize the region and keep people at home in supposedly the way that it's intended. And in fact, actually, even more intentioned development aid, let's say it wasn't given to corrupt government officials or corporate, CEOs who were just going to like, basically institute more peonage in like the banana orchards or whatever. Um, Actually, that too is probably going to spark migration. There's some really interesting studies showing that there is sort of a sweet spot for migration, and people from the most poor countries, the most like quote unquote undeveloped countries, they aren't the ones who normally migrate. It's more once people start achieving a certain level of economic stability, they can actually afford to migrate, and more people start leaving the country, which is like, should we not help these countries because we have, laid waste to them in many regards, economically and culturally. So maybe we should be giving some form of like reparations, I think is the better way of framing it instead of development aid. But you have to also realize the consequences there, like true reparations and truly sort of like helping some of these countries um, grow their economies a little bit, or helping them sort of claw their way out of, you know, just absolute abject poverty might actually spur migration, more migration. So we have to be ready for that, and blocking them off, like letting them achieve a level of economic stability, and so they can move, and then blocking them off is actually like again another paradox that we see. It's like this is why we need to, as we do all of the reparations necessary, as we try to tackle climate change and all these other factors that are making people move, we actually have to open borders. Otherwise, people are just going to be moving and they're not going to have anywhere to land.
Yeah, absolutely. And while you were talking, I was thinking about, the intentionality here. Um, and I recently read, following Biden's not very shocking, but disgusting announcement about essentially closing the borders to asylum seekers. There was an article in The Intercept that covered how this is like a very Democrat thing to do. And in 1994, at the very same time that then President Bill Clinton signed NAFTA, the Army Corps of Engineers began to fence the US-Mexico border. And so it's like there's this understanding that like, hey, we're going to do this thing that is going to be very, very bad for the people that are involved in it. And they're going to try to move because of it, and we have to make sure that they can. And so there's this very clear understanding how those borders work from the people who write these who write these policies at times. Um, and I wanted to get into a little bit about migrants specifically, because what you also highlight in the book is like how much of a toss-up this is in terms of like who's deemed unworthy or worthy. And at times how that's often based on the need for labor or the fear that
Mhm.
jobs will be, swept up by the invading hordes. And something that I think is like such a perfect example of this hypocrisy and the arbitrariness is what you write about in the book about the policy change with regards to Chinese migration. Could you talk a little bit more about that, like 180, and how this selective othering also speaks to that like nonsensical nature of these borders?
Yeah. The thanks for bringing up the Intercept article. That's by Natasha Leonard, a friend of mine and a great writer, and people should go check it out. I can't remember the title of it now, but yeah, it's a good recent article. It just came out after Biden's executive order, which is a moral disaster and will result in two really clear things if it continues in effect. I mean, there's a good chance that it's going to be enjoined by the courts. We'll see, but it's going to result in more people taking more dangerous journeys because they do not have access to safe or legal migration. And it's going to result in family separations. And this is a thing that I think's gotten a little bit less attention, but it's something I've been concentrating on the past year, ongoing reporting about family separations. And there is an exception in the new executive order that unaccompanied minors may still cross, uh, but only them. And there are, of course, still migrants who are young, who are under 18, who are migrating all the way from their home countries to the United States alone. But most young kids are traveling with their parents or their family members. And I have seen this firsthand where because of these policies, because of the extremely long waits to do it in a supposedly what is deemed like the right way, which still takes months and still leaves people in incredibly precarious places in northern Mexico, family members or parents decide to send their kids on alone. This is a coerced family separation. I witnessed late last year a mom say goodbye to her two teenage children in northern Mexico. They had been waiting for months. They hadn't gone to school in over a year. She was scared that because of the security situation there, she saw no hope in actually being able to do it legally. Her home was impossible to live in, and she said goodbye to her two children, and they crossed the border alone. We're going to see more of this under this new executive. Um, that was a distraction from your question, but felt like it
Not at
was.
all. I'm so glad that you brought that up, even though, like, especially as a mother, have a hard time with that. But I think it's so important that you highlight that, because I think that sometimes gets lost in just kind of like the stats, like people talking about like, well, it can't pass 1500. It's like we get lost in kind of the numbers game and forget that like this is somebody being torn apart from their children, which is absolutely
Yeah.
horrific.
Biden put out a tweet a day or so after the executive order last week. And he said he was sort of trying to stand on principle, saying, like, I'm doing this supposedly to make the border more secure, or it's not anti-humane or whatever, inhumane. And he said, here's what I won't do. I will not separate children. Again, we are dealing with one of these just paradox is the right word, just hypocrisies of the way that bordering happens is you can say that, but you're also not stupid. I mean, whatever, people can argue otherwise, but you have teams, legions of policymakers who understand how this works. They know that people are going to be separated from their children. They absolutely know. You can say otherwise, but you have to look at the effects. You have to understand that this will result in death, and we know it because of ongoing and recent and now decades of evidence. So they're not stupid. They know what is going to happen. They know that children are going to be removed, maybe permanently from their family members, from their parents, and they know psychologically that that is going to have devastating lifelong effects. You told me not to drop F-bombs, so I swallowed one there.
I did.
Um,
This is so much of my life on this show, is trying not to
yeah,
yell the F word
yeah,
very loudly. But I think that also shows that the inhumanity there shows that part of this bordering project is to dictate who is a human, who is not, who is like necropolitics, basically, like who deserves to live and who like do we not care about. And as you pointed out in your book, this has been like kind of just like a whack-a-mole policy since the advent of the United States, like who's allowed, Jews, Irish, Italians, people from Central and South America, Chinese. It's like it's just so arbitrary and indeed fluid, a bit like borders.
yeah. So to go back to your question about the head spinning, neck snapping, 180, multiple 180s about Chinese migration in the 19th century. So there was the Burlingame Treaty, which I think was 1868. Um, Interesting era. A lot was happening in the United States at the time. And if people forget, go look it up. 1860s America. And there was also, amidst a lot of, fallout from a brutal civil war and manumission, there was a huge building boom and construction boom, and the railroad construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, and Chinese laborers were able to get to the west coast of the United States in many regards more easily than people migrating like slowly across land from the East Coast, and they were welcomed because they were ready workers. The Burlingame Treaty, looking at the actual language, is amazing. It's like the mutual benefit and I don't have it exactly in my head, but it's like the mutual and beneficial exchange of labor, the friendship between our two nations, and the celebration of open migration. It was like, wow, it's like this was like an open borders like celebration. And a few years later, it was the early 1880s, there was the Page Act, which was like the first federal immigration policy that was implemented, and it was specifically targeting Chinese women. Followed very quickly on Following very quickly on the heels of that, there was a number of other, there's like a slate of anti-Chinese, specifically anti-Chinese legislation, which are collectively known as like the Chinese Exclusion Acts. And this was the first time that the federal government was taking from the states the power to enforce immigration. Before that, it was the states' rights. Again, thinking of the era, what did that imply? And this comes out of a brutal history. So it's not just the language that sort of was overlapping here about the contention between states and federal rights, but the reason that the federal government before that had allowed the states to enforce immigration, and they did. It was not a complete open borders world that we were living in, or open borders country that we were living in, was because in large part the same reason that states wanted to have their own rights. And because when an enslaved person was leaving a slave state, they wanted to be able to go and get that person. And so like we saw like the rise of like basically proto-immigration laws with the Fugitive Slave Acts. But the federal government, or the states, were worried that if the federal government had full control over immigration authority, they would not enforce some of those laws, or they would not comply with, like, because the northern states and whatever, they're like very wishy-washy stance towards abolitionism. They were worried that the states would not comply with returning their property, which is an enslaved person. Also in some of the northern states, New York and Massachusetts, they were enacting deportation policies and even immigration policies in like the early years of the Republic, early decades of the Republic. But finally, when there was like we had finished the Transcontinental Railroad, put in the Golden Spike or whatever, and they're like, you know what, actually, we don't need so many Chinese laborers. There's also a number of, again, with fallout of the war, there's a number of not repression, sorry, economic depressions at the time. It's like, you know what, maybe we need to stop letting in more Chinese folks. So first Chinese women and then Chinese people, and they were excluded until the 1940s. So Chinese exclusion laws were officially on the books until the 1940s. And then a number of really, really just abysmal Supreme Court decisions cemented this authority of the federal government to enforce immigration law. This is pertinent right now. So let's fast forward into the 2020s when supposedly Texas Governor Greg Abbott is having these standoffs with the feds in Eagle Pass, in some parks along the border in Texas, saying like, I'm going to block off immigration agents, federal immigration agents, from accessing the water. Some people actually drowned and died because they weren't given access to federal immigration agents. The Biden administration, meanwhile, is pushing back and saying, oh, Abbott's the bad guy. He's not treating migrants right. It's our authority to enforce immigration policy. These are not two sides to the issue. This is really important to understand. The federal government is not on one side, and Texas and now probably Arizona are not on the other side. They are on the same side. They are vying for control to enforce and expel and block migrants. There's not one party who's in favor of migrants here. They're both trying to keep them out and push them out. And the federal government is claiming the authority to do so based on those Supreme Court decisions allowing explicitly racist anti-Chinese policies to go into effect. That is where the Biden administration is citing those cases right now. So this is not like they're not our saviors of Texas to come in and like push back at it. They're trying to do it themselves. But yeah,
Yeah.
so just to put the final point on your original question, it's so transparent. I mean, clearly transparent. How can you go from celebrating the mutual exchange of labor and this policy of friendship between two nations to a decade later, complete ban on folks from China coming? Oh, it's just about labor. Just stop this.
Yeah, I mean, capitalism.
Yeah.
And with that, I want to shift to one of the arguments that you make, because in the book there are powerful arguments for opening borders based on history and economics, which you touched on a bit. But I really appreciate that you bring into the spotlight the environmental argument, and make a powerful case that rather than a militarized border saving us from the fallout of climate catastrophe, it actually blinds us to it and worsens it. Could you talk a little bit more about that aspect?
Yeah, so this is my favorite stat, as in my least favorite, that in a very recent 5-year period, the United States spent 11 times more on border enforcement than it did on climate change mitigation. Enforcing the border doesn't affect climate change. Actually, it has nothing to do with climate change. So knowing that vast swaths of the globe are being, rendered uninhabitable, you aren't going to fix that by erecting a higher wall. And here's one other point that is not exactly relevant to the environmental argument, is that one of the things I looked at in the book too is that we have decades upon decades of evidence showing that walls don't work, that people get through them, that immigration enforcement, the most draconian immigration enforcement, doesn't work. Doesn't work in the United States, doesn't work in Europe, doesn't work anywhere. It changes the way people migrate a little bit. It makes it harder, it makes it more deadly, but it doesn't stop people. So your wall isn't going to stop the people who are fleeing climate change from coming. So you can either address the underlying cause, or you can not stop them from coming, but spend billions of dollars trying. Like, again, people know this. Like, this isn't like a revelation that I am exposing. People who study this, people who enact these policies know this. Yeah, so I think it is a real problem. We don't know the numbers of what it will look like, but all forecasts point to doubling, tripling, quadrupling of the current population who are forcibly uprooted, and that, those numbers reach 250 million, 500 million in the next decade or so. That is, we're looking at orders of magnitude more people who can't live where they're living now, and they're going to move. Absolutely. And so we need to think about how to respond to them. And as I just said, like, trying to wall them off doesn't work. And let's say it did. Like, let's just play this out for a second. What is your end game there? Okay, let's say walls did work. So let's look at the country of Honduras or Guatemala, which they have faced devastating hurricanes. There's 2 that hit in just recent years, back to back, basically decades-long drought. Let's say you could wall them off. Is this what we're agreeing to? That we're just going to wall off a population of people in an unlivable territory and just let them slowly die there? Like, how is this a legitimate policy that people are agreeing to? Yeah, and I think that you have to understand that people are going to move, and you have to understand that, okay, much of the world is going to be different than it is right now in coming decades because of climate change. Let's come to terms with that, and let's think about a mutually beneficial way of dealing with it, because it benefits us none either, and we're not immune to the effects of climate change. People in the Western world, people in the United States, are paying out trillions of dollars in climate-related disasters. They are themselves uprooted in the millions, mostly temporarily, but not only. There's one other, I think, important point here that goes to just maybe sort of the way that we think about borders and the way that we think about the environment. And it's something that's sort of increasingly dear to my heart. I've been doing a lot of reporting on jaguars in Arizona, where I am now, and in northern Mexico. I'm working on a long piece right now. I spent some time in a jaguar reserve in southern Sonora. And jaguars, they evolved in the area exactly where I am right now, in southern Arizona and southern New Mexico. This is the original, like the place that the species developed. And then migrated south. They found that they had, abundant prey, and they proliferated there. We have been, like, a number of environmental organizations have been trying to reintroduce or think about reintroducing jaguars or letting them roam north from Mexico again. We have currently in Arizona one, maybe two jaguars, wild male jaguars, that are roaming here. This is a beautiful apex predator species that is incredibly important for our ecosystems. We know now that if you do not have an apex predator in an ecosystem, the entire ecosystem falters. We see this in Yellowstone with the wolves. We see this in Arizona with the paucity of jaguars. If we finish the wall, most of Arizona is now walled off. There are lots of gaps, though. There's 40 some gaps in the wall, and species, especially the ones who can't fly, are able to walk through those. If we wall off Arizona from Sonora, jaguars will not be able to survive. They need the room to roam. They need the genetic diversity that would happen if they had that extra space. So what we're doing is we are accepting the fact that we will never have a jaguar population again in the United States. And that has effects, as I'm just saying, not only on the ecosystem, but on humans. To think that we are removed from our natural environment is why we got into this problem in the first place with climate change. No, we are going to see the effects of this. Maybe they're not going to be as, I don't know, cataclysmic as what's going right now with climate change, but it does affect us. And and to think that we can just, like, oh, we'll just take that as a loss and just, like, carry on. No, like, we have to think about, like, what walling off our country is going to do to the environment. It's going to have enormous effect. It is already having enormous effects.
Yeah, and I appreciate that because, as you said, we are not separate from nature. We're a part of it. And if these animals have a right and an ecological, like, evolutionary need to move, then so do we.
Right.
And as you write in the book, to try to stop humans from moving is to try to stop humans from being humans. And I think, kind of wrapping up here, I want to, I know that we've talked about some history and we've talked about some present, but I think it's important to highlight, like, how recent some of this is. I mean, as you point out in the book, before the 1990s, there was almost no physical infrastructure along the U.S.-Mexico borderline. ICE was founded in 2003. And you also write that there are more closed borders today than at any other time in human history. And so, wrapping up here, John, I know that, I mean, it looks bleak, I have to say. Things have gotten worse very quickly, domestically and globally. And there's that case for open borders, which is, to me, that it's kind of like this earlier in the same show that I'll be editing together. We spoke with Mohammed Bamieh about the no state solution in Palestine. And one of the things he says is that when reality and realism are unacceptable, you have to go beyond. And it feels to me like the case for open borders is that the reality of this situation is so unacceptable. We must think of something beyond what we have. And so that is that beyond. And also, like, in the here and now, what kind of ways can we act, should we act, to make things better in the face of these literal and figurative walls and blockades that we face?
Yeah, good, daunting question. I think the history is important, and I think actually the history is one of the necessary ingredients for moving forward towards a more just future. You pointed out some, really key moments that somehow we forget. We are, a society of amnesiacs, especially around border and immigration enforcement. Yeah, ICE is 21 years old. The Border Patrol is 100 years old. Like, we have had a country before both of those institutions. Absolutely. In the year 2000, there were about 12 enforced closed borders throughout the world. Now there's about 80. It's a very short time. That is a fast proliferation of walling. I think I'm interested in this idea that we need to, like, imagine a better future. We need to, like, really sort of stretch our minds a little bit. one way, like as a reporter here, as like a local reporter, one way that I think like a necessary first step is actually something like the opposite of imagination. We have so much disinformation, misinformation, and refusal to hear information right now that before we can just kind of come to terms together, before we can get back on the same plane of reality with each other, we're not going to be able to move forward. There are so many people, especially on the right, who are claiming right now that we have open borders. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, like, have words lost their meaning? People talk about an invasion. Like, actually, that's just patently, factually untrue. They talk about numbers. Like there are people who throw out numbers that are wildly off base by the millions. And I have been talking, giving a lot of book presentations here, and then I just, as a reporter, I talk to people on both right and left, pro and anti-immigrant, and there is such a huge disparity in the basic understanding of the reality right now that I think we need to close that gap before we're able to even start talking about solutions. And I think that one of the key ingredients is just understanding our basic reality right now. That would be a good step. And then, yeah, we need to shake out of this status quo bias. It's like we think that, oh, without the way that things are now, that we wouldn't be able to exist. And there's a lot of other factors at play here. We are being told that sort of, I don't know, the extraordinary income gaps or inequality gaps in the world are just like kind of how the world is. Like that, just like we would take it as a given. Oh, unfortunate, I guess. Or that, yeah, millions of people are unsheltered and living in our communities, like in alleys and washes and in the Southwest, and like that's just the way things are. Or that there's this crazy and deadly opioid epidemic killing 100,000+ people, and just like if we think that this is just the way that it is, like and that this is what we have to deal with, it kind of makes sense when people come in and scapegoat somebody and say, oh, if we close the borders, things will get better, when actually they have nothing to do with each other. But if we can think, like, if we realize or remember that it doesn't have to be this way, that we can provide housing, that we actually can deal with medical and mental health crises, that we can, fund our schools to a degree that people are literate or media literate again, all of these basic things, like we can break out of this really honestly, like atrocious or ugly status quo, then we don't have to scapegoat and start just like thinking about like, oh, these problems are impossible to address internally, so we're going to have to try to address them externally. So I think like just kind of opening up our minds to knowing that a lot of this stuff is relatively recent history or relatively recent phenomena based on very bad decisions that we've been making, we can make other decisions. A solution to the border, a solution to the misery enacted by borders is actually not that hard. We just have to stop doing something. You know, it is really hard to run a marathon. Like it is like I can I do it? I don't know. But you know what I can definitely do? I can stop running a marathon. That's easy. I could stop it like in like 5 minutes. That's the same, it's like the same thing. We could just like stop doing this. Like it's not hard. Like we don't have to create, it's not this incredibly complex system that we need to either erect or dismantle. It's just like, no, we can just stop it. And that is, not the ultimate solution to a lot of the underlying causes, but that would alleviate all of these other problems in an enormous way.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And as you said, when you create the border and make it a crime to cross it, well, then you've created the problem.
Yeah.
So you could just not.
Yeah, use not. That is an option. And I actually talked to some people who are like, policy wonks. And like, what would it actually take to enact legislation that was opening the borders? And like, oh, it'd be simple. You just like write a law to undo the Immigration Naturalization Act, the INA. You could do that. You can pass a law. I actually mentioned this in the book. You can pass a law like the fastest ever done is like a day or two. This is like I don't know, some of the post 9/11 legislation. So yeah, we could have open borders tomorrow, maybe day after tomorrow.
Oh, would that would be the case.
Yeah.
Um, John, thank you so much for giving so much context and indeed giving people some things to imagine beyond the reality. Again, folks can check out the book, which is called The Case for Open Borders, and John's other writings are at johnwashington.substack.com. John, thank you again so much for taking the time to sit down.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation.